Who throws a wolf? Shit. So a couple days ago, I was talking to someone about indie games, and I offhandedly made a joke about not knowing what was and was not an indie game anymore. They asked what I meant, and I gave two examples of games that came out in 2019. Death Stranding, by Kojima Productions, and the Untitled Goose Game, by House.
Okay, now obviously these games are incredibly different. I mean, one is a multi-million-dollar game with an endless budget from Uncle Sony, A-list actors, decades of artistic polish, and Kojima-ness. And the other one is a game where you play as a goose. It should be an easy comparison here of, mega massive AAA game and small, weird indie game. Death Stranding was, of course, a big deal with tons of hype and interest behind it, mostly because of the madman driving the ship. But the Untitled Goose Game had something special behind it. Memeability. And I mean that in a 100% genuine way, because between all the memes of the goose, the pure silly gameplay, and the overall shareability of the game, I think, and this is gonna make me sound crazy at first, but I think the Untitled Goose Game had a bigger impact than Death Stranding. And there's a ton of things at play here, but I think the main breakdown is that, so I beat both of these games, and I could spend literally hours trying to explain everything that happened in Death Stranding, possibly without even talking about the gameplay once. And the Goose Game is a fun game where you play as a goose. You run around, you honk at people, you steal shit. Above all else, it is easily accessible and fun. But honestly, I don't even care if the Goose Game is a bigger deal than Death Stranding. I mean, it is, but that's not the point. Just a simple idea that if you told me in 2009, hey Chris, in 10 years you're going to care more about a goose than whatever Hideo Kojima is doing, I would think you're crazy. And also a time traveler, but mostly crazy. The idea that a tiny indie game could generate more hype and more social impact than a mega massive AAA super title with the hottest name and game direction on it, now that got me thinking. Originally, I planned to talk about indie games that outperformed huge AAA titles, but that video idea was boring and bad. So instead, I decided to take a look back and figure out how we got here. How we got to a time that people would rather play an indie game like Outer Wilds, The Goose Game, or Katana Zero than whatever major release Activision is pushing this year.
So let's take a brief walk through a semi-expansive history of indie games.
Okay, so this is actually where I hit the first snag in making this video. Indie games is this weird amorphous term that refers to like a specific kind of game, which is easier to codify a single game with than it is to summarize the genre. So I tried to look at what a lot of indie games have in common. A lot of them follow a very specific vision or simple concept taken to an extreme. They're usually made by a small team or sometimes just one individual. They're often made on tiny budgets or no budget at all. And they're often self-published or at least made without any influence from major games publishers. Oh yeah, and they're fucking weird. So I went back and tried to find the earliest example of this in games, and oops, that's Pong. Or Tennis for Two, or Doom, Wolfenstein, basically any PC game made before 1997. In fact, unless you were making a game specifically for the NES, SNES, or Sega, you were making an indie game. So this is actually where I think it's best to start, where indie games have always existed in one form or another, the PC. Hey, Chris from the future checking in. If you like the style of this video and want to see more video essays like it, consider maybe subscribing to Around the Monitor. We do this thing pretty much every week, and we'd love to have you. Okay, back to the video. Bye. Thanks. So back in the 1980s and 90s, computers were bad. Like, very bad. And the internet was even worse. So for software and game devs in the early 90s, the main problem wasn't coding your game or even making it good. The biggest problem is getting it to other people who could actually play it or even look at it. So to solve this problem, along came something called shareware. Okay, so shareware was originally a way for software engineers to share code and software developments with one another. Sort of a, you take some code from me here, I'll get some from you later, and it worked as basically a system of trading floppy disks between one another. Now, shareware evolved and twisted and did its own thing, but as far as games are concerned, it turns out these little bite-sized data packets are great for passing games between one another, or more specifically, individual levels of games. This method was pioneered by the guys at Apogee Software, better known as 3D Realms, the team behind Duke Nukem. Ugh. With their game, Craws, of which they would distribute floppy disks that had a set number of levels on it. And if you wanted the next installment of Craws, you sent a mail order in, or, God forbid, called someone, and boom, you just bought yourself a video game. The shareware system would stick around and become so profitable that eventually computer stores would start to stock racks of games on floppy disks. You know, those glorious days you could go into a Circuit City and get Doom or Half-Life on a set of 4 floppy disks. Shareware catalogs became a thing, and eventually online bulletin board services too, allowing a somewhat larger player base to access and discuss these games. And with increasing sales, these early PC indie developers like id Software, 3D Realms, and Epic Games became much, much larger, and began to be able to make games for Nintendo and Sega and the recently appearing Sony. And more importantly, they were given access to the dev kits. Now, before the ubiquity of things like the Unreal Engine and Unity, game development kits, or GDKs, or dev kits, whatever you want to call them, they were basically the keys that allowed a game dev to build their game for a specific console or a setup. Now, most of these were either bonkers expensive, or you actually needed to receive the kit personally from the company. And this wasn't a problem when everything was just ASCII screen games, text adventures, and 2D side-scrollers. But with the sudden and recent rise of 3D games and the absolute state of most people's home computers, consoles became a much cheaper and attractive alternative to trying to run these games on your PC. So now we have these formerly small, now quite big, developers who are openly working with the major consoles while also producing games for the PC market on their own. Other studios got investments and began to sprout up in what we now call third-party developers.
And honestly, I cut like 6 paragraphs just talking about the actual business consolidation and money behind games in the early 2000s, and it was incredibly boring and had very little to do with indie games. So let's talk about indie games.
During this time period, when the internet was becoming more competent and third-party developers flooded both console and PC market with content, where were the indie game developers? Well, as the internet grew in competence and tools became easier to both get access to and use, you saw a huge rise of bedroom coders and people creating smaller games as basically a resume piece. Something they could show to someone like BioWare or THQ or Blizzard, any respected, profitable, and well-managed game studio. Additionally, you have people who are just taking all these tools and all the information sharing on the internet and just making games because they wanted to make games. But now you have all these little mini games that face the same problem that the early PC devs faced: distribution. And luckily, the same innovations and improvements to the internet that let them make games help them publish games. There was a huge rise in browser gaming websites that basically became aggregators of all these small games made by individuals or sometimes independent groups. And this sort of kept indie games alive for a long time before the modern online retailers and game downloading services we have now became commonplace. But that was really it. Indie game development was either just a step on the path out of indie games and onto bigger and better things, or that was the end of your path. And so for a while, indie games just sort of stagnated, stuck in a state where the crop of indie developers was constantly being harvested by bigger companies, or these devs just never left the small part of the market they operated in. But all of that changed in 2004, when the most important indie game was released worldwide, and introduced a change that would shift the gaming industry as a whole. That indie game is Half-Life 2. Now hold on. I hear you saying, "But Chris, Half-Life isn't an indie game. Valve is big, and they won't give us Half-Life 3. Help! Trust me, I hear you. Your voices haunt me in my dreams, and I haven't slept in months. But, more importantly, yes, Half-Life 2 is an indie game, and I can prove it. Or you'll hate every point I make, but that's also fine. So, Half-Life doesn't have a lot of the aspects that I think commonly define modern indie games. The team wasn't notably small, the budget is weird because Gabe Newell promised to fund it himself if the money ever ran out, and it wasn't this simple concept game. In fact, it was a huge undertaking. But Valve is a very weird company. They don't have deadlines, and nobody is anyone's boss on the production side of the company. So every step of the creation process is kind of like a communal effort. This combination allows a space in which a very uniquely crafted game can be made. This gives us Half-Life 2, a story-based shooter that completely revolutionized physics and puzzle solving in games. But that's not why I think Half-Life is an indie game. Most of that stems with what Valve did with the finished product. Now, it's important to remember that back in 2004, Valve wasn't the insane gaming powerhouse and entity we know today. Valve was one of the companies that, in the early shareware era of games, sold games primarily through floppy disks, game catalogs, mail order, all that stuff I talked about earlier. Other than a PS2 port in 2001, a Valve game had never even been on anything besides PC. And in fact, there was only one Valve game at the time, until Half-Life 2. Half-Life and its expansions were the only thing Valve had made. But, sticking to their distribution roots, in 2004, Valve did a weird thing with the launch of Half-Life 2. At this point, most game devs are taking their games to major publishers, your Activisions, Microsoft, EAs, etc. But instead, Valve went to themselves, and using their brand spanking new online distribution client, Steam, Valve published their own game. And I want to make one thing clear, downloading games in 2004 wasn't unheard of, but the internet still sucked, and downloading full, huge, brand new releases, that was something special and very new. And after signing up for Steam, and 1 gigabyte of downloading later, you had Half-Life 2. You didn't even have to put on pants, and you just bought a new game. Valve had single-handedly cut out the middleman and made themselves the middleman. And now with proof that this digital distribution concept works, the gaming industry changed. I don't want to make it sound like it was overnight though. The Steam client and overall service was pretty terrible in 2004, and it also only had 1 game until they eventually added Team Fortress Classic. But that sweet, sweet Half-Life money poured in, and Valve expanded their portfolio with games like Team Fortress 2, Portal, the Half-Life 2 episodes, and more traffic came to their platform. And more boring business deals later, they started to bring other games to their platform, games not developed by Valve. Valve had gone from developers selling their games on computer store catalogs to being their very own catalog of games. And due to the extremely cheap method they use for distribution, the internet, and their digital primary business model, this allowed Valve and Steam to publish whatever the hell they wanted. And indie developers suddenly had a new option. Make your game, and let Papa Gabe publish it for you. Seeing the digital distribution model work as a proof of concept, and after realizing, hey, this probably isn't just a fad, every major console team started to scramble to steal this idea. And this worked in various levels of success, but companies struggled with what to actually fill their digital libraries with. Due to a bunch of reasons, including file sizes, codecs, and a lot of businessy things and contracts, full AAA titles weren't ready to be digitally distributed en masse. So, major titles had DLC available on things like the Xbox Live Arcade and PSN Store, or God forbid, the Wii Shop channel, but that was about it. Side note, music aside, the Wii Shop was trash. Anyway, Microsoft took the initiative to partner with an indie developer for their first ever Xbox Live Arcade exclusive. That developer was a man by the name of Jonathan Blow, and that game, Braid. Braid was a puzzle platformer with time manipulation as a core feature, and considering how puzzle platformer plus X pretty much describes a hefty chunk of early indie games, Braid stood as a pretty good standard bearer for indie gaming. And Microsoft endorsed Braid heavily, really pushing it as a big deal, even making it one of the focuses of their first Summer of Arcade indie game series. And Microsoft's investment and endorsement of Braid paid off super well, with the game receiving rave reviews and selling incredibly well on the Xbox Live platform. And following right behind Braid was XBLA's first major multiplayer game, Castle Crashers, made by some of those very same browser devs I'd mentioned earlier. Xbox's Summer of Arcade was a huge hit, and it drove tons of eyes to the Xbox Live Arcade platform to see what other indie games were coming out. Microsoft was able to make deals with these smaller teams to get indie games to be exclusive on Xbox before distributing elsewhere. And Microsoft followed up by bringing more and more to the service, really pushing the XBLA marketplace as a place to find premium indie game content. Releases like Limbo, Super Meat Boy, Bastion, Fez. Xbox had indie hit after indie hit that you could play on Xbox before anywhere else. And seeing the success, Nintendo and Sony scrambled to buff up their own marketplaces with indie games, and soon enough, all major consoles now had indie games in a featured position. Now, indie games had a comfortable home on both PC through platforms like Steam and the newer GOG, as well as a prominent spot on consoles. The age of indie games had arrived. And quickly the spread of indie games grew, basically becoming a mainstay on all major platforms, a niche option for the gamer looking for something different than the standard AAA offerings. The percentage of the market that was indie games grew as well as more and more indie hits appeared on the stage, with an actual indie game, Minecraft, becoming the highest sold game of all time. Indie game studios began to build fan bases and create game series or genres of games that appealed to those fan bases. Platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo would allow the advent of fan-invested indie games with much larger budgets. And for better or for worse, sometimes these budgets rivaled AAA games. The explosion of streaming platforms like Twitch allowed an even wider audience to at least experience indie games, even if they weren't the ones actively playing them. And sub-publishers, such as Devolver or 505 Games, started to almost exclusively publish just indie games, helping them to get a foothold on platforms that had become so oversaturated due to the rise of digital-first distribution platforms. And now here we are, where indie games have become such a mainstay of the gaming world, with games like Minecraft, Cuphead, Undertale, Celeste, and many more receiving massive praise and pushing themselves not only into the conversation for games of the year, but for some people's greatest games of all time. Couple that with the broadening appeal of gaming as a whole, and the increased shareability of games, and well, I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but in the last few years, I think it began to matter less and less if a game was indie or not. Indie games have become just as accessible as any, and I hate this term, but mainstream game. They're on every platform, they're often much shorter, which lends to a lot of gamers that don't have 60 hours to pour into something like a Red Dead Redemption or a Death Stranding, and the uniqueness of these games can lead to them being incredibly fun to watch and engage with, especially in a social capacity. And the fact that they cost typically $40 less than a AAA game, that doesn't hurt either. Because games are more accessible to make, more accessible to play, are being enjoyed by more people than ever, and many more great games and genres are being made all the time, I don't think it matters how your game was made, what company or lack thereof is funding it, who publishes it. I don't think it even matters who makes the game. We've entered an era of games where as long as your game is good, or at the very least interesting, regardless of how big or small the game is, people will find it, and more importantly, people will make memes about it on Twitter.
Is that Billy on the street? What was it?
Doing a thing!
Oh.
That'll be good outtake though. All the business consolidation and actual money behind games in early 2000s, and it was incredibly boring. I fucked that up, go to that. I looked at it offhandedly and was like, what does that word say? Oh, I need paper for that, fuck.
Hey, so if you're a longtime watcher of this channel, the whole time you might have been thinking, hey, that's not the same white guy I listen to talk about video games. And that's because there's actually a few of us that create content for this channel, but the only time we're all together is on a weekly talk show called Around the Monitor, which we stream live every Thursday on Twitch, which I'll put a link to in the description below. And if you're interested in learning more about us, or if you just wanted to chat with us, or just tell Chris that his opinions are bad and that Half-Life 2 isn't an indie game, then we have a Discord for that, which I'll also put a link in the description below. If you're new here, we're glad you found us. And if you're old here, consider checking out our Patreon. But either way, we're just happy you're here. And until next time, have a wonderful day.